Let me take you back to good old 2006, when Sony was more batshit than any gaming company could be at around that time. I personally remember sitting at the dining table with my dear dad when former Sony CEO Kaz Hirai announced the absolutely foolish price tag of the PlayStation 3.
PlayStation 3 will ship in Japan on November 11th, 2006. In Japan, the 20GB PlayStation 3 will retail for 59,800 yen. And the 60GB PlayStation 3 will have an open price, which the retailers will set. In North America, the PlayStation 3 will be available at retail on November 17th, 2006. The 20GB PlayStation 3 will retail for $499 US and 549 Canadian dollars. And the 60GB PlayStation 3 for $599 US, $659 Canadian. PlayStation 3 will be available in Europe and Australasia on November 17th, 2006. We will sell the 20GB PlayStation 3 for 499 euros and the 60GB PlayStation 3 for 599 euros, including VAT. We will be ramping up production to meet the already unprecedented demand for PlayStation 3. And today, I'm pleased to announce that we will ship 2 million PlayStation 3 units worldwide during the launch period.
My 12-year-old self was sitting at the table completely flabbergasted, and I'll never forget what my dad said next. He said, "Well, you won't be getting one." I was crushed. Ironically, I received one for Christmas the very next year, along with 4 games and 3 Blu-ray movies with it, but that's besides the point. The PlayStation 3, as we know it, went on a slow up climb that was extremely steep. Sony, with their egregious avarice and terrible decision-making, had to completely rebrand the console so it didn't sink the PlayStation brand. The PlayStation 3, which was at the bottom regarding sales and reception of the 3 big consoles of the 7th generation, only narrowly won out over the Xbox 360 at the very end of the 7th generation of video games before the PlayStation 4 was ultimately announced. But I'm getting too ahead of myself. Going back to holiday 2007 when I received my PS3, I had 4 games to play on it to begin with. One of those 4 games was Resistance: Fall of Man, one of 2 Insomniac Games titles that I received, the other being Ratchet and Clank: Future Tools of Destruction. As a long-time Insomniac Games fan dating back to their first major critically acclaimed hit with 2002's Ratchet and Clank, Resistance: Fall of Man was the first time in years that they had tried something new, having released several Ratchet and Clank games straight over the span of 4 years. Back when I played it then, Resistance: Fall of Man was a decent game. I was impressed with the large-scale battles depicted on screen, which wasn't previously available on older generation hardware the way it was seen on the PS3 at the time. I felt that the gunplay was solid, the weapon variety was plentiful, and while the story was definitely weak and didn't match up to other first-person shooter games released at around that time, such as Halo 3 and Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, the terrifying enemy design of the Chimera and bleak world design set in a fictional historical setting more than made up for that. Fast forward to today, after having replayed the game just recently with me being much older, with far more gaming experience than I had back in 2007, my experience with Resistance actually hasn't changed much. My opinion actually largely remains the same. Resistance: Fall of Man is a solid first-person shooter that has solid gunplay, plentiful weapon variety, and fantastic art direction and character design regarding the Chimera enemy units. Where the game, however, falls short is with its bland level design that's rather very linear but not dynamic enough in its linearity to be of any true value, and its story is especially weak. Diving first into what's good. The gunplay, if I had to describe it, is very tight, but it's not stiff. You're encouraged to aim down sights when engaging enemies, which makes the combat more engaging. And while this game had difficulty levels, playing on normal even makes this game a tough challenge. The reason for this is due to how the health system works, which doesn't rely on an automatic healing cooldown, which many games around this time started to use. Resistance instead uses a traditional health system where the player has to find health vials in the environment to replenish any lost vitality, which is split up into 4 segments. You play as a soldier named Nathan Hale, who becomes infected at the start of the game. As an infected soldier, Nathan Hale has the ability to heal, which also plays out in the gameplay. Before you lose an entire segment of health, taking cover and refraining from taking damage will replenish a single segment from the second level onwards to the end of the final stage. What's truly interesting here is that because this is an Insomniac title, they've brought over their renowned and creative weapon variety from the Ratchet and Clank series into Resistance. Every weapon in the game has a secondary fire that can be utilized in all sorts of unique situations, and every weapon, as you acquire each one over the length of the runtime, is available via a weapon wheel very similar to Ratchet and Clank. Some weapons are naturally more useful than others, such as the bullseye. This is a weapon that can fire these targeting darts or tags that can stick to opponents and attract the fired rounds of the user even around corners. This is very useful in situations where you're surrounded by enemies by yourself and need to strategically pick them off one by one, a common occurrence over the course of the game. Another intriguing weapon is the auger, which allows the player to deploy temporary shields that block incoming enemy fire, and it can even fire rounds through walls. The game has a satisfying balance of human and Chimera infantry weaponry, giving the player a unique variety to choose from. The best thing about the way the ammunition is dispersed is that it comes in sparse availability, which makes it crucial for the player to switch things up and use different kinds of weapons. The game forces you to experiment and use the best weapon for the right kind of situation. This game, with its diverse arsenal, in a way is a precursor to other more experimental first-person shooter games that came out years later, such as the rebooted Doom games and the rebooted Wolfenstein titles. Regarding the story, Resistance introduces an alternate history version of World War II. When these alien-looking monsters known as Chimera invaded the world and began to infect and take over entire countries and continents. The player controls Nathan Hale, who is a voiceless and dull personality that says virtually nothing throughout the entire story. He doesn't even have the cool bravado that other first-person shooter protagonists such as Halo's Master Chief or the brash black comedy dialogue of characters like Nathan Drake or the Gears of War protagonists. He's just there as an avatar to control in the story, but could have easily been replaced by any character. The story suffers from lazy writing and even worse presentation in the form of voice narration that's very jaded and doesn't give the player any reason to care.
No one knows exactly how Hale was infected by the Chimeran virus. Our only clue is a journal entry recovered from the body of a US medic. It says that he encountered a number of comatose soldiers in a dry creek bed. One of the soldiers, a sergeant, suddenly woke up. Unlike the other soldiers, his body had no wounds at all. The sergeant refused any kind of medical examination, insisting on catching up to the rest of the company. If that sergeant was in fact Nathan Hale, then he remains the only known person to wake up after being infected. Whether the Chimeran virus mutated within him, or whether his body had an innate resistance to it, remains a mystery.
Unlike franchises like Halo, Uncharted, Gears of War, or Call of Duty, there also aren't any interesting side characters to emphasize the dramatic tension that the game fails to build consistently. The only thing that this game succeeds at is building lore that's very in-depth and provides players with a dark depiction of just how terrifying and cruel the Chimera creatures really are. However, similar to the Souls games and other games that rely solely on lore and nothing else, without some solid writing to accompany the lore like you have with games such as the Mass Effect trilogy or the Gears of War series, the lore ultimately becomes background noise to what could have been a stronger game had the writing and narrative actually been taken more seriously. The enemy variety is actually very strong here in this game, as the Chimera units come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The primary unit you fight are the hybrids, who have human-like appearances, with the major exception being their spider-like heads, complete with multiple eyes and gaping maws full of sharp teeth. With a cooling unit strapped to their backs to keep their bodies from overheating, the hybrids appear to be an extreme version of enemies from the Ratchet and Clank series and far more terrifying to boot. These units come in different versions that pop up in various spots throughout the game, and they come in large numbers with vast health pools for each individual unit. With the AI programmed to flank the player's cover, Taking down a crew of hybrids becomes a grand task that requires the player to use their head to get through the toughest firefights thrown their way. As for the length, this is a rather long game, even if you were to skip cutscenes, clocking in at around 11 to 12 hours depending on the difficulty chosen and the skill level of the player. Similar to the Ratchet and Clank series, there are also secrets to find in the stages and skill points to unlock cheats and other unique awards, even if they're not as emphasized as the Ratchet and Clank games. At the end of it all, Resistance Fall of Man is one of the better exclusives that managed to be good enough to launch a franchise. And even though the Resistance series lost steam and eventually was discontinued before the start of the 8th generation, that mainly was due to how weak the second game in the series turned out to be rather than what Insomniac did with the first. I personally remember it as a strong launch title for the PlayStation 3, and one of the very few the system had back in 2006.